Well, welcome everyone. I always want to say good evening, but it could be good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from, as we have people joining from all over the world. But no matter where you are, thank you for being here. Today we are joined by author, professor, and artistic polymath, Willself. Will is the author of 11 novels, including Shark and Umbrella, as well as 7 short story collections and 7 essay collections. This live stream is an open window into the mind of one of the most inventive, agile, and celebrated creative figures at work today. It is my pleasure to welcome Willself.
Well, good evening, one and all. I don't know where you are. I don't know what time it is for you. It's early evening for me. And I have to say, not the most creative time in my day, but I'll get back to that in a minute. I'm going to have to assume, if you've tuned in for this talk, that you have some interest in my creative methods, because if you don't, I don't quite know what you're doing here. I always found it particularly strange when I come into contact, for example, with creative writing students, that they seem to have little engagement with what their teachers have actually written. And you know, there are a lot of books, and I'm speaking primarily about creativity in language, writing, speaking this evening. There are many different kinds of creativity, and I think I will touch upon some of the thinking, and some of what I say will certainly be congruent with how people think about creativity in the plastic arts, even how people think about creativity just generally in life, or even in relation to technological or scientific fields. But I'm primarily going to be concerned with writing. I think that's fair in the sense that it's kind of difficult to, for example, sculpt about a novel or paint about a novel. And we all know how dreary a lot of, in classical music, a lot of what is called program music can be. So I think there's it's reasonable that if you've tuned in, that you must be interested to some extent in my creative method. The other point I wanted to make right at the top is that, you know, I don't want to err too far into the actual business of writing in terms of style or structure. I think, you know, again, if you're interested in somebody telling you how to develop a literary style, or how to structure your writing, or how to structure your works, rather than how to find your creative wellspring, that there are kind of numerous guides out there for you. I mean, I'm always rather slightly perplexed by them. I remember doing a broadcast with Steven Pinker, the neuroscientist, when he'd published a book on, you know, kind of how to write or how to write well. And I thought, well, you know, I'm quite fond of you, Stephen, even though you're a kind of egregious Pollyanna-ish figure. But, you know, I don't really want to write like you, you know, so why would I read? And the same goes for Stephen King's famous kind of style guide, and numerous other kind of how to write a novel guides, which, you know, really are only going to tell you how to write a novel that might be written by the person who wrote the how to write the novel guide, which seems a reductio ad nauseum. So let's just talk about creativity, because that's in a sense much more interesting, and we have all sorts of ideas about what it is to be creative, and in a bit I'm going to talk about the distinction between being creative and being original, which I think is a different thing, and is a kind of bugbear really for anybody sitting down trying to be creative. It's almost what gets in the way of creativity is thinking, yeah, but am I going to be original at this, or am I just tiredly retreading somebody else's formerly creative idea? I'm going to push that idea to one side. I'm going to reserve it, as we say on cookery programs, and return to it a bit later. Why be creative? Does it matter? Maybe we should just be think unreflectively and get on with our lives. I think that the inception of the coronavirus pandemic, of course, has interrupted a lot of people's habitual go round, and probably made people a lot more reflective, because habit is an unreflective state. So that throws us vis-a-vis the question of why be creative. Again, I'm not really interested in addressing people who want to be creative in order to produce a product, okay? In order to produce a specific thing, that's their objective in a way. And certainly, I don't wish to address the problem of creativity, as it were, in relation to the creative industries, a ghastly phrase that's employed by policymakers here in the UK when they want to, reduce all of Badiou's categories, cultural capital, into financial capital, cultural capital, social capital, just make it all commoditized and fungible in that way. I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested, in people who want to be creative because they want to be free. In essence, I think of creativity as freedom. First and foremost, I think of it as a way into feeling free. I think, I always remember the kind of archetypal early meme, which was some, even before the web existed, some cartoon of somebody on the phone, and the Thinks bubble says, my body is in chains, but my mind is still free. And I think that circumstance applies to us, frankly, in almost every area of our lives. I think that we need creativity in order to exercise the only true liberty we have, which is between our two ears. And the greater creativity we can exercise, the greater and more radical our sense of autonomy in that respect. The other reason, personally, I'm interested in exercising my creativity is because for me it's a form of praxis, sort of fancy word for practice, but a particular kind of practice, a kind of practice that engages with the world outside, and indeed makes that world part of you and you part of that world. It's a sort of counter-insemination. Your creativity allows the world to come in and impregnate you with all of its incredible stuff, your senses, your perceptions, the free play of your ideas as provoked by those perceptions, and you go out to the world. You mix your imagination with the world by imagining things, by leaping off from the world as given to the world as it might be, the world as a temporal or a spatial counterfactual. You start to make a bit of the world your own, and again, that enhances your sense of autonomy and hopefully your sense of liberty. The analogy might be with John Locke, the philosopher's idea of primary accumulation, which lies at the background of really the foundation of modern states. The idea that if you mix your labor with the world, the farmer tills a patch of ground, that patch of ground becomes theirs in some way. So creativity is, I think, a way of being at home in the world, as much as being free from the world's claims, the claims of the nagging flesh. Some of us are differently abled, some of us may be impaired perceptually, and of course all of us have very different life circumstances. It's just not comparable, the state of mind of somebody who's kind of rich and powerful and the state of mind of somebody who is disempowered and poor. But I think creativity is a way for one and all to enjoy the only real autonomy that's going. Okay, how do we get to the business of being creative? How do we work at being creative? And it's been my job now for a very, very long time to try and do just that. Well, when I was at university, or if you're watching from the States, college, as you call it over there, or indeed, as young folk call it here now, uni, an abbreviation that reached us from Australasia about 20 years ago. What an attractive word it is. When I was at uni, some 40 years ago, I studied the Scots philosopher David Hume, and he makes a point about the imagination that has always stayed with me. And that is that the imagination can be conceived of as a combinatorial function. So Hume said, there's nothing that extraordinary about the notion of a mountain. It's commonplace enough. We know what a mountain is. It's a you know, an uprising of the land into an eminence of some sort, often with a peak, or rounded into a hill. And there's nothing that extraordinary, Hume says, about the notion of gold. We're familiar with the notion of gold. We know what gold is. Some with gold teeth, and that one's gone. That one might still be there. I sold that one. Okay, put them together and you have a gold mountain. And that's a rather extraordinary and miraculous thing, and can stand in its own way for the alchemical transformation that comes about simply by the combining and recombining of disparate images, ideas, and concepts. So I challenge you that the first way of thinking about your imagination is to think of it like a series of dials in a fruit machine, but huge dials, printed with many, many different words, many, many different concepts, many, many different ideas, many, many different sense impressions, tastes, you know, things you've heard, maybe even printed with many, many metaphors. Let's spin them all. Let's see how they line up. Do we get a gold mountain? Do we get something that's interesting? Do we get something that we think we can work with? I would argue that taking this combinatorial view, the job of the creative person, or the task of the creative person who wishes to be creative, is constantly to seek the combination and the recombination of disparate ideas, impressions, and concepts, to keep them rotating, to keep them combining, and to keep observing within oneself the free interplay of these ideas and impressions. You know, we can go back to the Romantics, we can go back to Wordsworth discussing, you know, or coming up with this phrase for the idea of his own artistic process, emotion recollected in tranquility. Had to have the emotions to begin with. And you might be a little damning about our own age, and again, I'll return to this in due course, and say that the signal methods of expression in our own age, which are the so-called social media, offer the exact opposite of that. If the writer, if the artist, the poet, even the practitioner of the plastic arts is seeking to recollect feelings, ideas, impressions, their combinations in tranquility, then the social media ask us to invent our emotions in spontaneity, which is why, of course, they're full of partisanship, bigotry, bile, knee-jerk reactions, and very little poetry. So the combinatorial, constantly running in the background of the creative person's mind, it becomes a complete habit. It becomes a habit in itself, and that's where I'm going to end up, of course. You've already seen where I'm going. The constant habit of combining these things is bolstered by, you guessed it, discipline. And you knew I'd get there quite quickly. The old adage, the old tedious sawhorse, whatever it is, 97% perspiration, 3% inspiration. I'm not really interested in the inspiration at all, if I'm frank. I'm really not interested. The inspiration is always ex post facto. It occurs after the fact of having made the unusual combination. You can't see the inspiration before you've made the combination. And remember, all inspiration is divine. So if you're a believer and you think that God or gods is able to communicate with you and give you what they call in French the donné, the essence of a work of creative art in that way, then all power to you. Those of us in the agnostic fraternity are waiting for that to happen, but we're not especially confident that it ever necessarily will. So what we do is, in lieu of God, we have a notebook. I don't like to sort of lean on modish arguments from neuroscience, but this is one that I do like quite a lot. You basically have 3 minutes of short-term memory. And you'll know this intuitively to be true if you think about it for a minute. You're all interested in creativity, so you've all had this experience already. You've thought up a little aperçu, a metaphor, an image, an idea, a line, a gag, and you've thought to yourself, that's great. I must note that down, and for one reason or another, the phone rings, your bath needs to be, the taps need to be stopped, or whatever it is, the kettle boils, you don't do it, and then it's gone. It's gone forever as well. You have that awful sense of vacuity that you have when you see a new building in the city and realize you can no longer remember what was there before. You know that you have irretrievably lost a little idea that certainly was creative and might well have been original. So every creative person should have one of these, and every creative person or person who wants to be creative should have it with them all the time. And I mean all the time, waking or sleeping or whenever. So we're already on to the tedious business of perspiration, and you may well be thinking to yourself, this isn't what I necessarily tuned in for, but in a way you did. If you want to be creative, this is the way that I've done it. And just to give you an example, I went through the pages of this, my latest notebook, this afternoon. That's the last page I did before speaking to you. And I've also rootled in my boxes to show you what's gone before. My literary papers are actually held in the British Library, and I make regular deposits to them every 2 or 3 years. So these are the notebooks since my last deposit at the British Library. So you can see this is about 3 years worth of notebooks. During that period, I've written 2 books, I'd say, and probably anything between up to 250,000 words of journalism, short fiction, essays, etc. So the notebooks have to fuel all of that. For myself, I think there's a weird kind of promiscuity that actually happens on the page, that you can actually get these ideas to kind of talk to each other. And if you put them down, you think, well, this is something that relates to an idea for a ceramic design on a plate, but this is a joke that I want to tell to one of my children, and this is a couplet that might go in a poem. I even, I used to work as a cartoonist to some extent, so I can't think of any in this particular notebook, but I sometimes draw cartoons in the notebook as well. And I think that there's a kind of miscegenation between these forms and ideas that occurs on the page. Just going over this notebook, I came across these notes in the last couple of pages. I also use it, of course, as a commonplace book, and I'll return to that. I note down quotations from stuff I've been reading and stuff that interests me. So here are some of the things in the last couple of pages. I've noted down a quote from James Lovelock's book, Gaia, very important and significant in the light of the current climate emergency. I'm particularly interested that he uses the pronoun, the plural pronoun there to refer to the biota. So he thinks the biota is a there. He wrote that book originally in the early 1970s. So I was thinking, is this a forerunner of the idea of, as it were, impersonal personal pronouns, or at any rate, non-gendered, non-binary gendered personal pronouns? Does it go back to the Gaia hypothesis? Underneath that, I've got a quote from something else that reminds me, actually it's also from Lovelock. He's got a little bit about how wallpaper in the 19th century was treated with arsenic to give it a particular greenish color, and that people are actually poisoned by their own wallpaper. And I related that in my notebook to Walter Benjamin's observation in a piece he wrote about how the middle-class interior of the 19th century came into being at the same time as detective fiction. So, if you think one of the first detective stories was Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter, or The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The Purloined Letter, of course, hinges on furniture, middle-class furniture. The letter is purloined from an escritoire. And Benjamin makes the point that the middle-class interior shivers into being as a site of a murder. And of course, there's the arsenical wallpaper, could be used to commit the ultimate Benjaminian murder in the interior. I've got an idea for a short story. I was thinking about a friend of mine, a writer, I won't tell you who it is, who always goes on at me about the asperity of his own prose style, that it uses very few adjectives, let alone, adverbs, let alone metaphors, God forbid. And I was thinking of writing a short story about how he pares his prose style down and down and down and down in a rather sort of Beckettian way until he's only able to produce one perfectly lucid word. And again, maybe hearkening back to thinking about Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote a story called The Man of the Crowd. I was thinking of calling this story The Man with One Word. I've got a quote from Saussure, the founding father of linguists, about how voices vary on the telephone, but you can identify, despite the kind of queered problematics of a phone call, you can identify people by voice very quickly. So I've got a note about that.